Okay, tonight finds us again in our study of the Gospel of Mark, as Mark tells us what Jesus did, as Jesus goes about acting and speaking like God, so that we might recognize what Mark said at the beginning of the book, which it is the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we might also come to the same conclusion as the centurion at the cross came to, where he said, truly this man was the Son of God. And tonight, as we are in chapter 8, we transition at the end of this chapter from the first section of the book where Jesus revealed who he was. And every chapter has had something occurring to teach and direct us and to cause us to conclude that Jesus was truly the Son of God. The Father testified from heaven at his baptism. We've had demon after demon actually come up and say that. We've had people concluding that. And Jesus certainly acting like it and doing the things that only God could do. And tonight especially, we'll have another healing of the blind. All through the Old Testament, it says that God gives sight to the blind, that God cares for those. But, no prophet, and to the best of my recollection and looking, no apostle, nobody ever healed a blind person but Jesus. It seems to be exclusively the domain of God, and Jesus has done it repeatedly, and he'll do it again tonight. So we're ending the Who is Jesus section as the apostles confess that Jesus is the Christ. And then we move to section 2, where he explains to people, his disciples primarily and firstly, what it means that he is the Christ. And so then we move to our reading tonight. In the first paragraph, verses 1 through 6, is Jesus now feeds, actually that's a typo, that's verses 1 to 10. That's verses 1 to 10. So it didn't take long to make a mistake tonight. But verses 1 to 10, Jesus feeding the 4,000. This is a miracle often confused and conflated with the feeding of the 5,000. It's a very similar circumstance. It's very similar language describing both. There's a few details that are different, but it's really recreating the miracle in the wilderness of bread from heaven. So Jesus feeds his people. So Mark 8, verse 1. In those days, when there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples, and he said to them, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. So they've gone through their supplies, listening to Jesus. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him, well, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? Actually, that's a pretty pregnant question if we think about it spiritually. Where in this desolate world can we find enough to feed us? Where can we find enough here to satisfy? Well, we can find it in Jesus Christ. So Jesus said, verse 5, he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground. And taking 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them. And they served them to the people. They had also a few small fish, and after he blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over from the broken pieces. So they start with 7 loaves and end up with 7 baskets, plus the thousands fed. As it says, verse 9, about 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. All right, so again, very similar to the feeding of the 5,000. It is in a different place, and it is a little bit farther from home. The last we had, as far as a location marker, was chapter 7, verse 31, where it says he went from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. So he's up in the region of Decapolis. He's north of Galilee. He isn't in a Jewish area. Now, there's still a lot of Jewish people living up in Decapolis. The 10 cities is what that would be in English, Decapolis 10, and Deca 10 Polish cities. In this region of 10 cities, there's a lot of Jews up there. So likely it was primarily a Jewish audience. But he's in a Gentile area now feeding. Now, one of the things that a lot of pagans believed was in an idea called henotheism. Now, we don't usually use the word henotheism, but it is the idea that there are gods over certain areas. We find it occasionally come up in the scripture. Remember the time that the Assyrians were fighting, and it was they thought they had lost because their God was the God of the hills and Jehovah was the God of the plains, or vice versa. And they lost on the hills or they lost on the plains. And they said, well, next year, let's fight them in the other place. And of course, it turned out the same thing, because who's the God of the hills and the God of the plains? But this idea of localized deity or regional deities, this is something that Jesus here is just smashing down. He's out of his home country and he's doing miracles. And likely there was a good number of Gentiles in the audience. And who does Jesus feed? He feeds them. Some think this was primarily a Gentile audience, and they find a significance in the number 4,000 as to a number that represents is representative of the nations. I gave a brief look into that for this study. Didn't have time to trace it down in detail. I don't see anything obvious. It might be, but I don't know that I can that I can put much in that for now. But it does seem to be that quite likely, just because of where they're at, there's a good number of Gentiles. And so he fed the Jews, and now he feeds Gentiles. And also, how'd the gospel go, right? To the Jew first, and also to the Greek, to the Gentile. And so up in Decapolis, Jesus now feeds 4,000. Well, he gets home, and immediately the Pharisees argue with him, and they want a miracle. It's like, man, I just fed 4,000 people last week. What do you want? Well, we'll find out kind of what they want. Verse 11 of Mark 8, the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him. Don't you like it when you do something nice for people and all you get is grief? And they were seeking a sign from heaven to test him, sighing deeply in his spirit, which is the only time we have something quite like that is in the agony of the garden, the time when he was exasperated because his disciples couldn't cast out a demon, and there was a little boy who was demon-possessed, and the demon was hurting him. And the father said, if you can help me. And Jesus, if. And then also at the grave of Lazarus. There's a count them on one hand. I just gave you 4, and to me, that's all I can remember. Occasions where Jesus is really grieved, where Jesus is really emotionally tore up by what's going on. And the Pharisees here cause him to sigh deeply in his spirit. And he says, and just picture him with an exhausted tone of voice saying, why does this generation seek for a sign? And just, I think, picture him wagging his head. Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he gets in the boat and goes someplace else. And so he did not, even with the patience of God, literally, even with the patience of God, he did not want to deal with these people. That this was exasperating beyond measure, beyond endurance. Why don't you give us a sign? And they were testing with that. Feeding the 5,000, they don't count that. Feeding the 4,000, they don't count that. I mentioned in the introduction, Jesus going about healing all these blind people. Who can do that? Whoever but Jesus did that. And like, nah, not enough. Now, the other Gospels, Jesus gives the general rule, you're not going to get what you're looking for. The sign you want is not coming. Matthew and Luke, in their record of this, they give us where Jesus gives an exception to that. So Mark has the rule, and they do too. He said, but in there, with the exceptional part, no sign will be given to you but the sign of Jonah, which is, of course, he was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and nights and came back alive. And so they are going to get a sign. What they're wanting is a super sign that on their own terms, they would finally come to accept Jesus. He would prove it to their satisfaction. And if I've said, and this maybe dates me a little bit because it goes back to the mid-90s, but imagine trying to convince the OJ jury, right? I mean, it was obvious that OJ did it. They had all the evidence that OJ did it. But what did those people not want to believe? They didn't want to believe he did it. They didn't want to say he did it. Even I think they knew, but they didn't want to say it. These guys are in that situation. They're demanding that level of proof, the thing that would make the OJ jury convict OJ in spite of themselves. That's what they want, and Jesus says, I ain't giving it. Only thing you're going to get like that, sign of Jonah, the resurrection. And what do they do with the resurrection? They disbelieve that too. And so Jesus said, no, you're not getting this sign. The thing you want, you will not get. And so he got back in the boat and he went someplace else. And so there is where we find him now in verse 14, doing something else. And with all this moving around and the like, guess what happens once again? They're short on food as they do their travel. And so I just think, truck stops are not my favoriteest place, but I am pretty glad that they're conveniently located in all the places that I travel. Because if I just get the least bit thirsty, if I get the least bit hungry, if I need to, find the facilities and just get out and stretch my legs a little bit or whatever, there's going to be a truck stop nearby. And so they don't have that luxury. And so we find them in verse 14. We find them once again in a discussion about bread and not having a lot of bread with them. Verse 14, and they had forgotten to take bread. As I say, that was a quick turnaround, right? Jesus lands in the boat, they get in a quick argument, and back in the boat they go. And it appears that nobody went by the marina store to stock up. And so they had forgotten to take bread and did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. Now, after the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000, you wouldn't figure that'd be a problem. I mean, if Jesus can feed 4,000 with 7 loaves, what can he do with one? But no, Jesus did not do miracles just because folks, in the boat with him were hungry. But at the same time, as they realize we are kind of short on provisions here, verse 15, he was giving orders to them saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And so he's making an order. Watch out for the Pharisees' leaven and Herod's leaven. Of course, they're in the area that Herod controls, and they've just had an argument with the Pharisees, and that's what Jesus is concerned about. But the leaven in it makes them realize we don't have provisions on this boat, and he must be getting on to us for that. And so maybe he's telling us not to buy from them. Maybe he's telling us not to do business with those people. I don't know. Would it be beneath those folks to poison the bread that Jesus and his people would buy, to mess with them in their provisioning? And so they began to discuss with one another, verse 16, the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, I guess so, he's aware. Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Okay, so Jesus was exasperated with the Pharisees, and now he's a bit exasperated with his disciples. And he quotes a prophecy, and it's interesting, this figure is common enough. It's in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel all. So I'm not sure if Jesus is quoting Isaiah 6 and 9 or Jeremiah 5 and 21 or Ezekiel 12 and 2, because all of them got the same basic idea. It says, having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up? And they said 12. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, do you not understand? So you need to understand, I am not worried about how much food there is on this boat. And just imagine, with one loaf of bread and floating on a sea that fishermen use on a regular basis, how many different ways could Jesus have provided lunch and supper and whatever else comes up? How many different ways could that have been accomplished? And so I was not talking to you about that. And we don't even know what the resolution here is with the one loaf, right? Did they put in somewhere to buy some more on the way? Did they just miss a meal and have a real late dinner when they got to the other place, or did they just sail in there famished? We don't know, and honestly, we don't care, right? Because I'm real concerned when I miss lunch. I'm not so very concerned historically when other people miss lunch or dinner. It's just not that big a deal. We never see the resolution to what did they eat, because it's inconsequential. But what is consequential? The leaven of the Pharisees, the influence of those people, the mindset of those people, the unbelief of those people, the self-seeking partisan attitude of those people, the corruption and the self-seeking of Herod, right? Not that many chapters back, he had John the Baptist killed. He's living with his brother's wife. He is raping the countryside to enrich his pocketbook as a corrupt leader. That's worrying. That's a problem. Self-seeking and not loving others and looking after only yourself and your partisan interest and your group, that's a deal. That's a warning that Jesus, as it says here, he warned them, right? It says he was giving orders, verse 15. That's a thing to give orders about. And so that's the bread and the leaven discussion. Now I think we come to the last event of the first part of the book. I think we transition with the next story to the first part of Act 2. So this ends, as it were, Act 1. I know we're about halfway through the book already, but this is the first section drawing to a conclusion. And they came to Bethsaida. So Bethsaida is the river, the town at the river that drains into the Sea of Galilee. And so again, we're still up in the north, and the second part of the book mainly takes place in the middle part of the country. There's a geographic distinction in the three sections of the book: in the north, in the middle, in Jerusalem. And there's also a topical difference in the first, the second, and the third. And in our first section, what's been going on? Well, we've been seeing by common testimony and by action that Jesus is the Son of God, right? That's what we have been seeing. And we as believers, we've been with this since verse 1, right? We're glad he is, and we're learning about it. But Mark is writing to people, John actually says, I write you that you might believe. I think Mark wrote that you might believe as well. We have the benefit of reading this, knowing the ending. We have already come to the thing that Mark is guiding us for. And so we've seen him as the Son of God all along and at every step of the way. They are coming to realize in this the unfolding of the story that he's the Son of God. And we have this yet again, the healing of a blind man. We'll also in the next section, we'll end that with the healing of the blind in Jericho as well, just before they head up to Jerusalem. So sections 1 and 2 both end with healing of blind men. All right. Well, this miracle is to us a little odd because it seems to go against one of the things that we commonly think of with miracles, which is just complete instantaneous healing, right? Like when Peter healed the man at the beautiful gate in Acts 3, he gave him the ability to walk. He reached down and he grabbed his hand, and he pulled him up, and the guy is just walking with Peter, holding on to him and jumping up and down. No days in rehab, right? There's no ankle exercises, no foot stretching. There's no calf stretches or calf exercises that guy had to do. He is just boing up, and he's healed. Well, that's how most miracles appear to be. This miracle's one of the few that's not. And we think, what is the deal with that? Well, I'm going to tell you what I think the deal with that is. All right, so Jesus heals the blind man in stages. Verse 22, and they came to Bethsaida, again, so they're very north of the Sea of Galilee. And they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he said, "Do you see anything?" And so with spit, Jesus uses that as an instrument to heal. A number of people have already been healed just by touching his clothes, much less touching him himself. But this guy actually has this physical interchange with Jesus. And so he's laid his hands on him, he spit in his eyes, and he said, "Do you see anything?" Now, generally, I wouldn't be real happy with people spitting in my eyes unless I had a good chance that was going to cure me of something serious. But he looks up and he says, "I see men, for I see them like trees walking around." And so from that description, "I see them like trees," he sees them in a blocky form, right? He's not seeing full resolution. He's seeing in just kind of shapes and shadows, and he can see movement. He's got a whole lot more vision than he had a while ago, but he doesn't have full vision yet. So it says, then again, so a second time, then again, he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored and began to see everything clearly. And so with Jesus putting his hands on his eyes, and then that man looking intently, he was healed, and he began to see everything clearly. I think the way this is said, began to see everything clearly. I think this is not just a physical healing, but like every healing has multiple things going on, right? Every healing confirms the word that this messenger is from God. There's confirmation, right? That's one of the most things we're most familiar with about a miracle. And then also with a miracle, there's the great compassion of God. Every miracle is a compassionate act of God that shows his care for his people. And actually, even the two negative miracles, right, the striking of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5 and the striking of the false prophet and sorcerer Elymas in Acts 13, those are demonstrations of God's justice. And it's actually a mercy to his people that these liars and hinderers are separated. And so even that we might stretch into mercy, but it shows God's holiness more even than his mercy. But in any case, most of the time a miracle is merciful. So we've got it's powerful, and it's confirmation of the word, and it is what I just draw a blank on what I was just saying here. So powerful, confirmation of the word, and compassionate. All right, so we got those three, but there's also another thing that's going on. They are emblematic of the spiritual power Jesus has. Him making the blind to see, right? He can bring us spiritual vision. Him making the deaf to hear. He can make us hear and understand the truth. Him making the lame to walk, right? So instead of being helpless, we can walk in God's way. We can walk with him. All the leprosy is a type of sin in the scripture. He can cleanse us. He can, and all these other diseases, he can cure us of what ails us. And so that's the emblematic function of miracles. They teach a greater spiritual truth than just the physical thing that occurred. Even though the physical thing that occurred is great and powerful and merciful, there's a greater spiritual truth. Okay, so what's going on here in the Gospel of Mark? Mark is trying to get us to all see and acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God. As Jesus has gone around through these 8 chapters and these several years of work and doing his teaching and doing his healing and doing all the things that Jesus has been doing, what is it that we should see that he's really the Son of God? And what are people beginning to see? The apostles, the disciples first, and then others with them, they are beginning to see clearly that he's the Son of God. And so this question, what Jesus asked the blind man, he asked him in reality, and he asked him about his physical sight, but it's emblematic of the whole thing going on. Do you see anything? And so as we've come to the end of the first part of the Gospel of Mark, we might ask spiritually, do you see anything about Jesus yet? Do you see about Jesus? And someone might say, well, I can kind of see it. I'm getting around to seeing it. I can kind of see what you're looking at there, or what you're wanting me to look at there. But then, as it says, when he looked intently at Jesus, he began to see everything clearly. That is about his eyes. And there is no doubt that that man began to see everything clearly with his eyes, better than I can see right now, and that's why I got my glasses. But if we have listened to Jesus and listened to Mark in faith and received the teaching, what can we say like the blind man? I am beginning to see everything clearly. I am beginning to see everything clearly. I am seeing Jesus clearly. That's what this was all about. And so that ends section 1, that the people, the apostles first and the rest of the people who believe, they are beginning to see clearly that Jesus is the Son of God. All right, now we know they saw that clearly because now Peter is going to confess Jesus as Christ as we begin the second part of the book. So Jesus went out, verse 27, along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do you say that I am?" Well, we know this discussion. They said to him, some are saying John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and others one of the prophets. So everybody's got you in the prophet ballpark. They're just trying to figure out which one of the prophets you are. And I got to say, if viewing Jesus as one of the prophets, at this point, that is advantageous in so many respects. Now, if you just stop there, that's a problem, right? And that's the Muslim dodge. The Muslims say Jesus was a prophet, but not the big one. Nope, we're not accepting that. You guys are heretics when it comes to Jesus. No, but the people are at least in the prophetic ballpark, and we credit them for that much. But he was questioning them and say, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ. You're the Messiah. You are the one that God sent." Now, in the other Gospels, in Matthew and in Luke, we'll have the additional things that Jesus said, that he would build his church upon that. And of course, a bit of discussion. The Catholics think it's on Peter himself, and us Protestants are pretty sure it's on the confession of Jesus' nature itself. But the church is going to be built on this. But they are beginning now to clearly see that Jesus is the Messiah. And it's Peter who makes this first confession, that the parallels was Matthew 16. 2 chapters later in Matthew 18, everybody makes that confession. They're all on board with this. And so they clearly see he is the Messiah. Everything he says about himself is true. Now, the second section of the Gospel of Mark is Jesus now explaining to them what that means. What does it mean that he is the Messiah? Now, I did skip reading a verse a while ago in verse 30, when, in verse 26, he said to the man, "Don't go back to your village." Right? Jesus is kind of keeping this to the degree possible, this conclusion, a little bit close to the vest. And so in verse 26, he told the blind man healed not to go back to his village. Now, verse 30, he tells the apostles, he says, don't tell anybody about me. Don't tell anybody that yet. So he's going to have some more development, giving them time to come to this conclusion. And I think it would be disadvantageous, obviously. Jesus seems to think so too, so I'll say that, that everybody would know he's claiming to be the Messiah. We know the unbelievers will use that as an excuse to put him to death. There's a lot of people who may not have enough information yet to gather he's the Messiah. But in another couple of years worth or year and a half worth of ministry and teaching and miracles and activity, more people will have time to come to that realization. And when you first come to the realization that Jesus is the Messiah, but that doesn't mean he's an earthly king. That doesn't mean he's the Messiah you're expecting. He is the Messiah for sure, but not in the way that you're expecting. Some people are troubled by that. And I know that people are troubled by that because we see the reaction of Peter when Jesus tells him what it means that he's actually the Messiah. Verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man, and that's a prophetic title of the Messiah from the book of Daniel in the 7th chapter. It's one that Jesus uses repeatedly and will use even at his trial as he tells the Jewish authorities who it was that he was. And so he began to teach them the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. That word rejected, that's exactly the word of Psalm 118:22. The stone that the builders rejected became the very cornerstone. And so Jesus is summarizing all these prophecies and all this great body of material about himself, and he says he will be rejected. The being the Messiah does not mean he's coming in victorious in physical terms. Oh, he's going to be victorious beyond belief in the resurrection. But to get to the resurrection, first we have a rejection and death. He will be killed. He says, I'm dying at this, right? You know, you think about the prophecies that said he would hold forevermore the throne of his father David. How does a guy who dies get on the throne forevermore, right? And isn't he going to go down there and they're going to dig up the throne of David out of the ash heap or out of some archaeological dig, or they're going to have some craftsman remake the throne of David, and they're going to set it up in a prominent place, and he's going to sit there and he's going to rule and reign, and all the nations will come to him. That's what the prophecy said. Well, all the nations do come to him. He is on the throne of David, but not in the way that they expected. And so he began to teach them that he will suffer, he'll be rejected, he'll be killed, and after 3 days, he'll rise again. That's the sign of Jonah we mentioned, or the Lord did it after 3 days, Hosea 6:2. So it is God's will that this is the way it was done. This is what God actually prophesied through the prophets, but they had the wrong way of looking at the prophecies. And so when Jesus said that, as it says in verse 32, he was stating the matter plainly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Okay, I just said you're the Messiah. I just said you're the Christ. Now let me correct you on how this is going to go. And Jesus, again, not letting that go, turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind on not on God's interest, but man's." Men want Christ to have this big earthly kingdom. They didn't want him rejected. They didn't want him killed. They wanted him to rule and reign in glory. He does that, but not in the way they ever suspected. And so the way of the cross is the way of the Messiah. He is the suffering servant who bears the iniquity of his people, who by his stripes we are healed. But that means he had to take the stripes. The stroke that was due fell upon him. That means he got the sword in the side. And for them to think of the Messiah taking the sword in the side and being put on the cross, being humiliated and mocked and stripped, they couldn't take it. And so what does it mean that he's the Messiah? That's what the next chapters are going to tell us. But he's going to tell us that we have to go this way of suffering, which for all of us, which is what he did because we follow in his steps. Verse 34, and he summoned the crowd with his disciples. So now we're teaching everybody. We're teaching them the way of the cross. Not as plainly and specifically yet as he taught his disciples, but now the crowds who were following him with them. If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So self-denial in the way of the cross, that is the way of the Messiah. And they thought the way of the Messiah was glorious victory. It is after. It is spiritually, but it isn't always on this earth. So deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow me. Jesus will literally take up a cross. It's figurative. It's a figure of speech that we take up our cross. But we put our own interest behind the interest of God. And what if we did get the victory? And what if we did get the riches in this world? But verse 36, what does a man profit to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? And so the way for our soul to have salvation is in the way of Christ, the way of self-denial, the way of humility, not in the way of self-aggrandizement, and not in wealth. What would a man give in exchange for his soul? And then he's going to summarize from Daniel 7 again. He says, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, and here's Daniel, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father and with his holy angels. Jesus is coming in glory, but it wasn't when he walked into Jerusalem, right? Even on the triumphal entry, he went in there on the little baby donkey. He didn't go in there with sword and armor and army charging the gate. He went in with people singing the Psalms. And that was as glorious as it got by physical attestation. We see the glory in the cross because we honor the self-sacrifice. We see the glory that was wrought through the humiliation, and we view it as glorious. And then we call the day he died Good Friday because it was so good for us. But mercy, what a day it was for him. And so Jesus tells us all we're going to follow him in his death. But the victory is we'll also share in the resurrection. And so that's the beginning of the second part of the book, where Jesus, because he has these people who are beginning to see clearly, although we see they're just beginning to see clearly, right? They got one part real clear, but one part real not. They're going to see more clearly over time. But actually, going back to the blind man who saw in two stages, he saw in stage one, he saw the blocky outline. But he saw in stage two, he saw it all clear. Peter and the apostles here, they're seeing the blocky outline. And when Jesus gives them the detail about the rejection and death, they don't get it. But what do they see in stage two? What do they see after the resurrection? Why, then they see in true absolute clarity. And so that miracle of the blind man who sees and then sees a little better or sees more clearly coming, that is the story, that's the representation of the apostles and of the believers who, okay, so there's a bit they're seeing clearly, but there's another stage of clarity yet to come. And so that's now going to be our study for the next couple of weeks. Lord willing, as we get into this second section, which will be chapters 9 and 10. Let me see my notes. Yes, sections 9 and 10, this middle section, the short section, as Jesus will several times more explain to them about what it is that, what it means that he's really the Messiah. He's going to go through this conversation about death and rejection. He's going to go through that with them a total of 3 different times it's recorded. And then, of course, we know from Luke, he explains all these things after the resurrection, which is when they really first start, to get a whole lot more clarity. So our next 2 chapters, 9 and 10, this middle section is Jesus gives his teaching from recognizing he's the authority and he's the true Messiah, but he guides them to greater understanding. And then our third section, starting in chapter 11, when they go up to Jerusalem for the confrontation, for the rejection part, but also the glory in the resurrection. So that'll be our study next couple of weeks, and looking forward to the latter part of Mark.